Ladies and gentlemen, we're so excited today to have a reporter for Business Insider. Her name's Juliana Kaplan. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm genuinely so excited.
Oh, how nice. Well, I loved your recent article called The Bachelor Election, how the reality TV show became the pivotal demographic in the 2024 election. I love when we combine the Bachelor talk with real life. So tell me, are you a Bachelor fan? Is that why you put two and two together?
Uh, yes, unfortunately, I'm actually wearing my Pit Dweller shirt today for my Game of Roses friends. But
Nice.
yes, I am a longtime reality TV watcher, much to, I think, my parents' chagrin and anyone who has to talk to me. But I am a huge Bachelor Nation fan. I think I started watching in high school, early college, so right around the Nick Viall era. So, yes, and I've been there ever since.
And I love what you mentioned in your article that there are so many small niches in the world. You can have a content creator who just covers K-pop or Netflix or
Mm,
Hulu, but The Bachelor is one of the last fully known water cooler conversations. So that it's kind of withstood the world of streaming TV. It's
mm.
like old school TV that people still talk about. That's pretty rare in today's world.
Yeah, 100%. I feel like for me, I remember a very distinct moment. Like when I first started watching The Bachelor, I was also and continue to be a pretty big fan of RuPaul's Drag Race. And at the time, that was, I think, obviously like a much more segmented fan base in terms of what you were seeing with The Bachelor. And I remember half of the fun of watching The Bachelor is like you go on Twitter, you read all of the recaps, you read Allie's recap, like over at Vulture, whatever. There's all these characters, there's all these TikToks, all these Instagrams about it. And it's kind of fun to feel like you're participating in this wider cultural moment, right? Like I feel like especially with the way Twitter has become segmented too, I've been thinking about this a lot. But it was and it is the monoculture, all of these other little esoteric shows, even the White Lotus when it first began, right? There would be a very devoted group of people tweeting about it or posting about it. I love the Only Murders in the Building subreddit. They're pretty robust, but you could go about your day-to-day life and never really encounter those, right? But any social media platform, you're gonna find some Bachelor influence, some Bachelor influencer. You're gonna be talking about it. I mean, my parents texted me actually about Only Murders in the Building. They're they made a Golden Bachelorette joke when they were introducing Steve Martin and Martin Short. It really
Right.
is so baked into the culture.
Yeah, well, you know what it is we all know the premise. There's roses, there's breakups. It's just so the brand awareness is so big. But yeah, like you mentioned, there are shows I watched the show Alone, which is like a survival show. They have their
Mm.
own spin-off podcast. And I'll always look at the different podcasts to see how many reviews they have or are people watching this? And are they? No. I mean, it's hard to build a big audience as a content creator with some of the niche shows because even the Netflix shows like Love is Blind, it's a huge show, but they
Mm.
dump all the episodes out all at once, so it doesn't command, in my eyes, the cultural conversation the way The Bachelor does, where you have 6.5 days to discuss between episodes when there's something like hotbed happening.
Yeah. No, 100%. And it's really, I don't know, it's really interesting to me too, because I think The Bachelor is such a holdover from this early 2000s kind of reality TV culture where reality TV was just, and any television could be a lot more omnipresent. We're still talking about Jersey Shore to this day, for instance. That's still a cultural reference they're making. I also think there was a really interesting moment in reality TV when I was little. I watched the Tyra show fairly religiously, in middle school, which what that did to my psyche, who's to say? But there was this era of reality TV in the 2000s where it's let's kind of come do experiments on humans, right? Where you would be doing all these crazy things to people, and the whole premise is what would happen if this thing, if you were to pretend to be not the popular girl for the day. This is a crazy tire show episode where somebody gets facial prosthetics put on and goes to high school as an ugly person. But there was this kind of oh, we have this platform, we have this ability, let's do human experiments. And that's kind of what The Bachelor was born out of in a way. Like there is obviously the match show and there's like dating tradition, but The Bachelor is like, let's take it one step further. And it's funny now because we see it as kind of like the old stalwart, but like because we have Love is Blind, Too Hot to Handle, Perfect Match, all of these things. But at the time, like this is kind of a crazy premise, right? So I feel like also because all of that other reality TV has kind of, it's ended, it's lost to the sands of time, whatever. But The Bachelor is still going pretty strong. And then as we talked about in the article too, has been pretty good at like courting a new fan base, which, so it's like such a cultural product. Yeah, I don't know. I think I lost the point.
No, that's the show for you. But you're so right. It's interesting because I think because the show is so sanitized, it's a Disney show that, they're talking about fantasy suites, but there's so much context that it remains up for interpretation that you really do see all the commentary spill out into the social media. What I find interesting is that the show, like any corporation, is going to do its best to just maximize profits, right? Corporations are psychopathic. They don't feel feelings. And I find that to be very interesting because that's what led to some of the issues. They know their audience is primarily white women, and then they weren't providing diversity to tell new stories and possibly find new voices. What I've noticed, though, is with podcasting, I believe skews a little more liberal than maybe YouTube, which might be more centrist. I'm progressive, but my audience is all over the map. The only thing they have in common is it's 92% women. So how do you think the show navigates the ethical conversations of inclusion and equality and things like that, with also trying to just be a show and stay on air? I'd love your take as an inequality reporter to look at where The Bachelor was maybe 5 years ago versus where it is now with inclusivity of non-white people on the show. And what do you think it was that sort of forced that change?
I think it was almost this coalition between the contestants and the viewers. I remember, for instance, back in 2020, obviously, well, to back up a little, in 2018, and we talk about this quite a bit in the article, there was sort of this first like political fissure. And I think a lot of that was chalked up to the fact that Becca Kufrin was like a pretty outspoken Hillary supporter, fairly liberal. Which, from a lead, we've definitely like had leads who have said a little bit about their political beliefs, but I think was a little bit, surprising, perhaps pleasantly so, because I think it's always nice to learn a little bit more about where people are coming from. And then it became very clear that her front runner and eventual winner, Garrett, had very different political ideas. They were sort of on different ends of the spectrum. And I think that there was obviously a lot of criticism for him for the kind of content he was engaging in, but it was still very rooted in like, are they going to be able to be a match, because they're coming at it from very different angles, which, as we read about, is like a very American conundrum. You're going to meet people who are not in your political bubble. But then in 2020, and that sort of set the groundwork for people, I think, to be really hyper vigilant about what's going on with contestants and what are they signaling from what they're posting and what they're liking and who they're following. These are all things we've seen come up in sort of like the fan communities at large. And then obviously, in 2020, there's this sort of larger racial reckoning, and The Bachelor throws Matt James in as their first male Black Bachelor. And I think the producers have talked about this too in the past, that was a season that I think had its own issues in terms of the support that they provided to him. But this was also a really pivotal moment because that social media tracking revealed some even more serious things regarding his eventual winner. And I actually read his book. His thoughts on it are super interesting. I highly recommend everybody read Matt James's book. But it was the first time we had a contestant coming out and saying, what I did was wrong. These things are wrong. It is due to these larger issues of inequity and racism baked into American life. I didn't think it was basically I didn't even know it was wrong when I did it. And that's kind of a larger issue. And that, I think, was very representative of a lot of larger political sentiment at the time. we saw the huge Black Lives Matter protests happening, and a lot of people, and also to your point, a lot of corporations really being forced to publicly reckon with the ways that they had kind of uphold those foundations of white supremacy. And then there is the Chris Harrison of it all, where the host, who I think is fairly beloved, it still seems to be like pretty good friends with quite a few people in Bachelor Nation, went on Rachel Lindsay's podcast. At this point, Rachel Lindsay is kind of like the designated speaker for all things race in The Bachelor, which is its own issue, because if you cast so few people of color, then it all becomes one person's job, and that's not a fair burden to put on anybody. And Chris Harrison, I think this is the first time like he's being sent as a representative of the show, right? And he gets pretty worked up about it. Like, he is really defending these things that even the contestant herself, Rachel, was not defending. And that kind of became this really pivotal moment. And at that time, we suddenly see contestants from like past seasons. Like, I think we see the women of Matt James' season, if I'm recalling correctly, like putting out a mass statement, being like, we do not agree with this. We see the men from, I think, like Claysha's season, from Claire and Tasha's season. We see like these coalitions of, the very few people of color who have been contestants on The Bachelor. And at the same time, there's sort of like this parasocial feeding into it of the fans being like, we support you, we support this, and in kind of like this ever iterating cycle. And I think that having the reason that The Bachelor works, Ben Higgins talked about this with me, is that people want to see themselves in the contestants on the screen. They like this relatability. We obviously see, as Game of Roses talks about, parasocial players who are the ones that have the biggest success afterwards, like somebody like Hannah Brown, who is immensely charming and fun, and the whole point is like she seems like somebody who you'd want to be friends with. Like, she's making all these funny TikToks with Tyler, will they, won't they, right? And so all of a sudden, like, the fans who've been identifying so strongly with this and had also been kind of dictating the narrative in some ways with like forcing them to talk about Garrett on stage, all of a sudden they're like, if we band with the contestants, we can have this power to kind of rewrite that narrative. And that, to me, I think was a really pivotal moment that was also very interestingly reflective of politics at large, because I think if we look at this moment in like the broader world right now, there's a lot of talk about like rolling back of DEI initiatives, that, the DEI era is done, and so on, which is, I don't know, a very interesting through line to me. But even with Jen's most recent season, where like they did talk about having their first Asian American bachelorette, Jen was great. Very randomly, I actually bumped into her while I was home in Boston. And we had been at the same cycling class. She looked amazing. I was like, I don't know how you did that. But to that end, like, they're touting it's this historic season. Obviously, that season kind of like ends in this crazy ruins. The men, plenty of stuff out there on them. But there was also, I think a lot of people caught on that a few of the men said they were expecting to see a white lead, and specific women from past like eras of the franchise. And at the same time, that was still never really addressed in like the absolute like decimation of the season falling apart, right? Like, I think I've seen a lot of fan discussion of how it always feels like women of color come in last compared to their white counterparts in dating. One of my friends was actually saying it feels as though The Bachelor has entered into its like, Obama era, where it was this idea of like, oh, we're in this post-racial era, like we have an Asian American bachelorette, and that's so normal that we never really need to talk about race again. And then it's very interesting, I was talking to two Black girls, one Rose, where like we obviously like have a lead of color, and there's still, I don't know, like the ways that some of the attacks on different women of color and women in the franchise also mimic those that people are making against Kamala Harris. Like, I mean, it's not an exact analog right now, but I think I've seen plenty of people very easily turning on Jen, being like, she's in it for the clout, she's in it for the dancing with the stars, right?
No, you're right. Well, there was a sort of a tokenism that was, oh, you would never expect the contestant of color to get past the fifth round because it was kind of like bring him in, and here are going to be my 7 final white choices, and that in part was due to the sort of casting that wasn't being done. Like Rachel Lindsay said, they didn't cast her season. They didn't cast black men that wanted to date a black woman. They were, they weren't kind of going to that next level of like finding the contestants that worked there. And that's why with Matt James, and I mean, call it what it is. They rushed him to hire him as the lead during the height of the Black Lives Matter movement. That to me doesn't deserve a pat on the back. That's like we're 10 years too late. Let's just fix the problem now. And then with Jen, and people get very mad at me for saying this, but she's well known to be their third choice. So they don't get like a cake from me that they're finally having an Asian American lead when it wasn't even something that they were literally like the day before going to have Daisy and Maria. So it's like I don't give them ever any credit, but I think like you're saying, you have to, as an audience, you have to speak about these things because their change won't come unless the audience demands it. And the change doesn't need to be superficial. It needs to be deeper and better casting situations where you can really get people that live in these worlds of diversity and live in a world where they can see themselves dating somebody either of their race or outside their race. Like the conversation happens because of the lack that we see on the screen. So it's not like the audience is like, because some people will make it seem like, oh boy, you make everything about race. And it's like, well, it doesn't have to be if the conversation is already happening, but it's just a response to that lack that we see out there. And so when you talk about like DEI, for people in the audience that might have a misconception of what it is or just the idea behind it, the simple term people use is diversity hire, which takes away from any merits someone would have. So what are your thoughts on DEI, and have you noticed that that's sort of incorporated into the casting process in a way that it wasn't before?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I actually will say what they're doing with the casting on Grant's season does make me feel a little bit optimistic because I think when we talk about DEI in the world outside of The Bachelor, like so much of the issue of making workplaces, organizations, spaces like actually reflective of the diversity of the country and like who they're supposed to be speaking to and who they're supposed to be representing is that through like myriad systemic issues, there's just not that pipeline of candidates who might think like this is for me or have historically been like this is not a place for me, and kind of laying the groundwork to make sure that those candidates are like in the pipeline and creating a robust pipeline, because it's not going to be like an if you build it they will come situation, which I think has been The Bachelor's excuse for a while. Like plenty of people of color I'm sure are watching the show and saying like, well, they only go for, white people who look a certain way. And I think that starting the casting process really early for Grant's season and being really explicit, like that people are applying for Grant, has been a really pleasant surprise to me, actually, in terms of like, if we're thinking about broader DEI, like creating a pipeline of like, not only people who are really specifically excited to be there for Grant, but like giving yourself the time to actually like probably like talk and sift through more applications and talk to people who maybe, in a past year, like wouldn't have applied or do that outreach with him. So I think that that's actually like a good example of something that you could be doing. And I think there's also, I was talking to my friends and I think this made it into the final cut of the article. I'm actually not sure. But this season was the first time I've ever seen a conversation on screen about faith where neither faith was Christian or like based in Christianity. Like I'm Jewish and I think it's very interesting to see the show's relationship to religions outside of sort of this like vague Christianity. But between Jeremy and Jen, we had a conversation where Jen is Buddhist, Jeremy is Jewish, and to like actually have a faith-based conversation where neither faith was Christian was like, to me, I was like, oh wow, I actually feel represented. I feel like I saw lots of comments about that as well.
Yeah, and it's like for the producers, don't be afraid to take those risks. Just because your audience might have the largest demographic might be in evangelical South, it doesn't mean your audience can't play up to the level of learning about Buddhist culture or learning about what a Vietnamese meal looks like on a hometown date. Like let's all play to that higher intelligence. But I love what you mentioned about DEI and the pipeline of casting. It's kind of like this. I always look at like the term DEI, which is a term they're probably going to have to rebrand because it's already been sort of weaponized. But I look at that as like, you're just trying to find out, like, if you're going to do a race, you want to bring as many contestants to the starting line to find out who's the fastest person. Mm-hmm. If 7 white guys win the gold medal, well, we're clearly, we're not inviting everyone to the race. So it's not about like the equity of outcome it's not the equality of outcome where everyone, it's predetermined. It's the equity of opportunity. And when you take Grant, what they basically did was they ruined the surprise of who the Bachelor is going to be in exchange for trying to get more people to want to submit to be on his season. So you burn the element of surprise, and people go, oh, why are they surprising us? But then they're going to get 50,000 new submissions, and they really just need to find 5. They need 5 great people. The rest are filler villains and this and that. So yeah, it's a little early to make our speculations, but all signs point to they're finally doing the work to cast better people for the lead. We have to admit, I mean, Jen's men were not cast for her. Who knows if it would have been different, but like if they weren't there for her, you could almost understand the morale of the room was like not all hyped up and the competitive juices weren't there for her. So like, that's not her fault. If people were expecting Grant and then they got me, they'd be like, we don't want this white podcaster guy. We wanted the tall finance guy, So it's really about them stepping up to like getting the best people there because the show is so dependent on the great characters. Your article, we've talked about a bunch of different things, but your article talks about the election. So make your case for how The Bachelor could sway the election, because I found that very interesting in an election that could be decided by tens of thousands of votes.
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, this is like key programming for at least the Harris Walls campaign to be advertising against. And I'm very curious. I would love to actually hear from your viewers. So here in New York, I don't think we saw any Harris Walls advertising. This makes sense. We are not a swing state. But I know that they did a huge spend on the Golden Bachelorette. They did this huge spend, I think, on the end of Jen's season. So clearly, like, somebody over there was like, this, demographically is important to us. I think it was the shows that they were targeting outside of like political programming. So, outside of your Fox News, MSNBC, whatever, it was like The Simpsons, The Bachelorette, and like Love and Hip Hop Atlanta, which I thought was very interesting. But I think too, kind of like the larger point in terms of what this means for the election, a really interesting sort of shift to me was that at least my perception of Bachelor contestants was they are conservative until proven otherwise. I think that's why like a Becca Kufrin is a pleasant surprise, right? Because that's somebody where you're like, oh, this is a person who's fairly outspoken about politics, which I think is also like still relatively new. Like a lot of them are very, I think representative of the American electorate in that they're like people who are from, maybe the South, more middle America, who are not super politically engaged, which is fine. I think that's just like a good chunk of the American electorate at large. But I always am like, a Bachelor contestant is conservative until proven not. And I actually do think that has switched up a bit over the last few years. Like the Garrett thing was such a big deal because that was obviously like in direct conflict with Becca's stated politics. But if we think about, I can name at least a few contestants over the past season or two who have allegedly been liking some right-wing posts. I saw a Reddit rumor that one person who had been liking right-wing posts and following right-wingers did go onto Kamala's page and like every single post on there. within a few hours. I have not independently verified that. If that's true, I think that is a very funny thing to do. But I do think that that is really telling, right? Like that it is, oh, like there's always going to be conservatives on The Bachelor, but it used to be such a big, like it became a big deal when somebody was actually vocally conservative. And now people are like, oh, we know this to be true about conservatives and people on The Bachelor who are conservative, but it is now a given, I think, amongst at least a slim majority of the fan base that that is not something they agree with.
Yeah, you do see this like sort of cultural divide because to be fair, Garrett was kind of called out for problematic things that I would say don't necessarily align with conservative values. They were just like
Mhm.
asshole, like you could call them racist, anti-immigration types of things, which by the way, with the current rhetoric would line up with political issues. Like there's a lot of political issues that are weaponized. And I would like, do you think of a contest? Because I'm, like I said, I actually live in Tennessee now. I've lived here just for this year. I was in Los Angeles and I was up in, Hamilton Heights near Columbia, I think is where you went to school, right? I was up there on 140th. Like I was
Oh
in,
my God, I used to be at 141st. No
there you
way.
go. We were probably going to the same, the plantain guy that sold whatever. I buy all the street meat on the
Yeah.
corner. I've kind of always like as an adult lived in very blue cultures, politically speaking. But I do look, and I always try to look in the other direction of like, sort of like what would be so wrong if someone was just standard conservative. Like it almost feels like the Bachelor contestants are in hiding because I think a lot of conservative values have been hijacked by the MAGA movement. So it's almost like,
Hmm.
are you conservative or are you MAGA? Because there are different, if so, and again, I do think the old school conservative party has been hijacked and is dead. If someone's conservative because they want to spend less money on foreign wars, it's like, okay, but that's not what the Republican Party wants to do, So it is there could be so many more rich conversations, but I think we're so quick to judge what someone's values are, especially these people are in their, early 20s where they probably still have like residual values left over from their parents in some of these cases. So
Hmm.
I just look at it and I go, was Garrett a horrible person? I'm sure not, because Becca stuck with him for a little bit, but then you
Yeah.
get that pressure to go, are you going to change? Are you going to be better? Are you going to learn? So someone like Rachel Kirkconnell goes, she gave the most honest answer, which was, I had no idea what my blind spots were. And I think, as Bachelor Nation has shown, when you give somebody the room for growth and take away ego and defensiveness, they're going to come to the side of, yeah, no, plantation parties were super racist and super whatever, but I just had no idea. So like, I do love when Bachelor audiences reward the contestants for having that space to grow. But as we see, sometimes the response from a Bachelor contestant is to double down on their ego and double down on whatever their toxic belief is. So it definitely creates a what side are you on conversation every year when they announce the contestants. And we have to know, I guess we have to know the political leanings of the lead to know what kind of contestant they're going to want to choose. So do you think now they're asking these sorts of questions in casting, like politically, before they even get that far? Or do you think they enjoy the fact that this kind of comes out dramatically during the seasons?
Yeah. So my understanding, actually reporting the story, is that they do ask that. I think that they are asking this already of contestants. I think they have been for a little while. I think that, and this is based a little on what I've heard. I mean, I think that probably a lead could come in and say, like, I don't want to date any Republicans. I don't want to date any leftists. I think it's a question of like whether that statement will be completely abided to, right? Because what you were saying, like maybe they'll cast 5 people who they're like, these are people who are probably politically in the same sphere as this person, very much their type from what they've told us, geographically convenient, right? And then maybe they'll like cast a few people who think very differently. I think that as to your point, some of the politics have amplified around, race or racist statements, for instance. Like we saw at least one person on Rachel Lindsay's season who came in with some pretty bad racist comments earlier. And I think that perhaps the next step would be the understanding that just like politics have become so heightened that casting somebody who is opposite politically from the lead will not just like create drama, but like actual trauma.
Oh yeah, especially when they're so far like opposite that they're literally saying racist things and posting. Yeah, like Lee's situation was like obviously one that should always be avoided because there's no nuance in those. Like, oh, are you for like small business? There's no nuance there. And I feel like in most cases, audiences are pretty reasonable from like some like a contestant having said something 9 years earlier and apologizing for it and versus like what are your beliefs now. When you talk about the election, I like I said in Tennessee, I'm shocked when I get a Kamala Harris ad because this is like a deep red state. But even a deep red state is still 65-35. Like it's not 100-0. So, I wonder if even though a state might not swing in one direction or the other for the president, if they're just still trying to slowly chip away at that base and slowly start to grow. I know in Texas, the Democratic Party wasn't really investing much money in the races there, but now they're showing it's actually not a foregone conclusion that it'll go red. It's like leaning red, but there's like a Senate race that's up in the air. And like you mentioned with in Atlanta reality show, like that's if you're the Bachelor, or if you're Kamala Harris, you want to be advertising on a show that's gonna have a good niche audience in Georgia. I mean, like we're talking 10,000 votes can decide the election. And for, I think in the article you mentioned that Joey Graziadei was probably like tell me about that. You think Kamala's team used him as like a campaign like strategy?
So this actually predated her being the candidate. This is what's really interesting to me. So this was right after his season had aired. So it wasn't like a preseason promo, but it was still at this point, Biden was the presumptive nominee. Because this was back over Valentine's Day. Like it was a Valentine's Day tie-in. And I actually will say, I do think that the current White House, and especially now like the Harris-Walz team, has been really adept at using influencers and online celebrities to make a dent and reach people. I mean, we saw there was like an influencer pen at the DNC, right? All these influencers invited. And I think that's I think that's generally a very smart way to reach younger people. I know also like the Trump campaign has been doing this as well with like different podcasts and doing different things with different influencers. But the Joey thing, I can't stress this enough, happened before Kamala was the nominee. Like he was at the White House basically doing like a cute Valentine's Day video. And I think there's such interesting resonance to that now because he did the video with Doug Emhoff, who I think has now kind of spawned his own parasocial following. And Doug is like asking him for pointers on presenting a rose. And Joey's like, you're doing great. And then he presents it to Kamala. And the fact that a Bachelor may have literally presented a rose to the future president of the United States is crazy. Like, I don't know. And it's funny too because one thing that actually inspired me to do this article is like, as people might be able to tell, I follow the Bachelor subreddit, and on the subreddit, people were like, oh my God, this is so fun. This is so cute. Like, go Joey. Love this. And then he posted on Instagram, like he co-posted, I think with like the VP's office or whatever. And all of the comments, because Joey's following is, I think, more representative of perhaps like Bachelor viewers, the Redditors. Shout out to all of you. I think are maybe people who are a little more invested and a little more like deep in the pit freaks But like Joey's followers, it's like, oh, I watched The Bachelor. I think Joey's cute. I will follow him. And a lot of the comments on that were people posting like puke emojis, being like, Joey, I thought you were better than this. And to me, I was like, what an interesting display of the ways that this like fandom is still torn, you know?
Oh no, I see it firsthand because, like I said before, you're not going to meet someone more progressive than I am when it comes to the policies I want for our country and the sort of like base level minimum wage, social programs, and everything else. Raised by single mom, like think we all could use a helping hand. The rich don't pay enough to help the poor. That's where I stand, and I also think Jesus would have stood the same way, which is why I always rail against religious people to go look, Jesus is on my side here, or whatever religion people want, like the sides on helping your neighbor. But I see my audience as across the spectrum. From pretty far right. I mean, this year I teamed up with a very right-leaning lady journalist as we covered the Clayton Echard case, and it ruffled a lot of feathers of my audience on my left. And I always just say this, like Chris Harrison, his whole scenario, like you said, kicked off a big sort of chain of events that has led to a lot of change in the Bachelor world. But I think, and I disagree with what Chris Harrison said, but I think if he was doing a long form conversation and not a 12-minute extra TV interview, that he wouldn't have been so rushed and he would have prosecuted his point better that he was trying to make, which is that times change. Even over the last couple of years, times have changed a lot from what was acceptable, not necessarily to certain groups, but like we look at Perez Hilton, we look at we used to accept horrible treatment of Britney Spears from Barbara Walters. So like from 2020 down to Paris Hilton, 2020, the program, journalists, there was a lot of blood ethically on people's hands from the way things were treated. So I understand what Chris Harrison was trying to say, but he didn't do a good job of that. And I think what we're seeing now is channels like mine, channels like Game of Roses, channels that can say, you know what, we'll take 2 hours to talk about this, are having more success than the 20-second TikTok video of a Joey handing a rose over and then getting the puke emoji. Rose, puke emoji is not like deep conversation. So I do think it's easier to get along and exist with people you might disagree with, because look, in the world we live in, you got to go out to, like, I love Pete Buttigieg, a pretty blue guy, right? I love that he goes on Fox News. You have to go and talk to people that don't already have your vote. And The Bachelor has that opportunity because it does have a following, like we started talking about, that is monolithic, that is not just niched down into, this Love is Blind might be this way political leaning versus whatever. It is across the spectrum. The show itself wants nothing to do with politics, right? Because they want to capture as many audience as possible, to the point where I think I was the only one calling this out. I don't think anyone else called this out. There was a big race topic, and the show did not address it on the After the Final Rose, to the point where I think it led to Michelle Young calling them out. Then the show addressed it on their podcast. So the podcast leans left, just like Reddit leans left. So the show was able to not ruffle feathers with their sort of like 8 p.m. whoever watches it live conservative audience, and then let the podcasters speak to their audience, which I think is like spineless, but I'm not surprised. So you get to see the different factions of audience that listen and watch from different bubbles. And I think the longer you're willing to speak to the bigger audience, the more reasonable people are. But just like Joey had the puke emoji, I get it all the time. I mean, I had some pretty progressive videos last month that really, I lost hundreds of followers over that. And then at the same time, I have the subreddit thinking I'm some conservative, whatever they want me to be. So like, there is so much weaponization on the far ends of like an inability to have a conversation. I try to reject that for the 90% that I think are reasonable enough, including my Republican friends that'll still hear me talk. Maybe one day they'll say, you know what, Dave, you got a point, but I'm not writing them off. And I wish the audience wouldn't write off people that they might disagree with, and just give people a chance to educate each other. I don't know. Maybe that's way too optimistic to look at in the heightened political world we live in. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that when all of the Chris Harrison stuff went down, I think it did evoke sort of a wider issue in like the US political, and not even just like political, but like day-to-day landscape, because like everything is obviously inherently political, where it's kind of like, I think there was almost a sentiment among people, especially people who watch The Bachelor, again, white women, speaking as a member of the community myself, where it's like, if you find the one person who has caused this strife, we can make some sort of change. And I think that, you know, when you look at the Chris Harrison stuff, the show sent him out as a representative. He said the things that he said that I think were personally incredibly jarring to hear. And then the show was like, we have fired Chris Harrison. And I think he's like spoken about this too, where it's like, Chris Harrison is the host of your show, you know? He is one person. He, in fact, does not actually like control, I think, every single aspect of the casting process and the choices that you've made and who you've chosen to platform, right? And I think looking at that during that same era, I was talking to Chad about this from Game of Roses, and he does some really interesting stuff talking to his right-leaning family.
Right, yeah.
And talking about very like polar opposites. And like that moment feeling very, and during like the Trump era especially, like everything feeling so dire politically. Like to your point, obviously like the MAGA movement has continued. I think that there was a sentiment in the 2020 election, right, that if we got this one guy out of office, right, we're going to fix everything. Which is just not really how like I think anything in life works.
Yeah, that's using a Band-Aid to fix something where you need to like really fix it from the inside out. And just like you were saying, I mean, Chris Harrison, that's like not liking the presidential policies and firing the press secretary. It's like, but by all means, it could imply further change. But I think it was, like you said, people thought they just got the bad thing, and then it took still a few more seasons where I think at some point they finally hired a black producer, that they didn't have, so they weren't, telling the stories in the right way to even start. And so yeah, it's a good point that like these conversations require, that it doesn't end. There's no finish line to the conversations, and those that might find it exhausting, they might just have the privilege where it doesn't affect them. It might not affect them to have a conversation about something so simple as making sure there's equity of opportunity within the show. But I do think it'll make for a better version of the show. We got to get you going here, but where can people find you? I've really enjoyed, if anyone hasn't already, check out your Business Insider article, but you definitely should talk more about the Bachelor Nation as sort of, as it parallels to the sort of demographics. But I can't wait to hear your thoughts after the election.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Oh boy. Yeah, but where can people find me? I think I'm technically still on Twitter. I'm like, I have to check. I mean, you can find me primarily on businessinsider.com, Juliana Kaplan. And I think my Reddit handle is actually the same. You found me via my work Reddit. So you'll see me asking people all the time if they want to chat. So feel free to reach out to me there if you think you have a story I should look into. And on Twitter, it's at Juliana M. Kaplan. Yeah, but read businessinsider.com. Just go on the website, click on every single story.
Yeah, it could, and it could be that, it could be that your article was the thing that changed the election. It could be that close. We'll have to see. I hope it's not that close, but we'll have to see. But great.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Any predictions that you want to make on which way it's going to go?
No, this is my grounding exercise, and I hope that it provides perhaps some comfort to everyone else, which is that, you know, obviously as a reporter, keeping up with the polling, keeping up with what the sides are saying, covering all of that. But as a human who exists in the world, I have just been doing go back 4 years to this month or like this time and think about how crazy like things changed day to day, you know? Because I remember going into the 2020 election season, February 2020, Bernie Sanders is like the presumptive Democratic nominee. You know, people are saying, oh, it seems like Trump will probably win again. And then famously, some other stuff happened in March of 2020. And I would say that so many unprecedented things happened every single month that I'm just like, if there is one thing I have learned from my last presidential election, 2020, is I will make no predictions because untold chaos will probably unspool before we actually get there. And I actually think that this theory has really held up because I was on vacation and there had been a lot of talk about Biden potentially stepping down from being the nominee, which I was following. I didn't have like a ton of inside lines on that or anything, but I was like, I'm pretty sure if he would, it would happen during this time while I was on vacation. So I like messaged my editor and I was like, I bet he's going to step down while I'm on vacation. And in fact, instead, there was an assassination attempt on Donald Trump. So I was like, even when I have made my prediction about the crazy thing that I think is going to happen, something I hadn't even imagined happened. So no prediction. I think just think about how you felt in September 2020 and then how that changed between then and November of 2020 because of the sheer number of things going on. And then maybe use that as your grounding exercise.
Yeah, that sounds great. I really appreciate hearing your thoughts, and we'll have to have you back after the election. And thanks again for stopping by to chat with me today.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was so excited. I was actually like at a WNBA game when you emailed me with a bunch of my Bachelor squad, and I was like, guys, Dave Neal just emailed me.
Well, I'm happy you responded. Thanks again. Have a good one, okay?